I got this question from a subscriber named Jennifer. Hey Jennifer. She wanted to know the whole process of how to onboard a new client and from start to finish. So from first getting them all the way until finishing their books at the end of the month and sending an invoice. You guys know I need to say, hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, huge compliment. Alright, so I kind of broke this up into 4 parts. The first one is kind of the initial interview. The second part is kind of a time of training. Then there is the initial kind of first couple months where you're ramping up. And then there's just the normal bookkeeping month-to-month work. So kind of starting out with the interview, the initial meeting of your client. So I have a whole video on how to get clients. I'll leave it linked below. But in some way, shape, or form, you guys have connected and they're interested in possibly becoming your bookkeeping client. You know, maybe it is because you contacted a business that you liked in your area and that you wanted to work for if you're being gung-ho on the marketing trail. Or maybe they've contacted you because they saw a post on social media that you made, or it is an acquaintance or someone in your circle that's been referred to you through word of mouth. So then I'll contact them. Usually I prefer email just because I feel like people can get back to you and at their convenience and think about things. But usually I email them and say, let's set up an initial phone call to talk about, you know, what each of our needs are and to see if we'd be a good fit. And if this is a local client, I'll probably meet with them either at their office or a coffee shop. And if it is someone farther away, I'll do a Zoom conference call. So we set up the initial interview and I have a whole video on that and all the questions I ask, but you definitely want to be very clear about what they're expecting and kind of like what the workload looks like. And then make sure you do talk about pricing in your first interview because that can definitely be a deal breaker and you want to know sooner rather than later. Even though, I mean, sometimes it's kind of awkward to talk about pricing and how much you're charging, but it's better to get it out in the open. All right, and then usually I'll send them home with a couple things, a contract, and then kind of the next steps or the information I'm gonna need going forward. And I have sent ahead of time my initial questionnaire. I have emailed it before the first meeting. I don't typically do that, but like for example, if a client is like, oh, I'm really short on time, or wants to make the most of every minute type of thing, then I'll just email them the questionnaire ahead of time so that they know what we're going to be talking about, and they have even emailed it back to me with a written response before. So you can kind of play that by ear. All right, and in that initial interview, usually I can kind of tell like if the person is a good fit, if they want to hire me, and if I want to hire them. I talked about reasons why I might not hire someone in my last questionnaire or my last Q&A, so I'll link that below. But basically, if they're too small or if, I don't know, sometimes it's just not a good fit. But if both people are on board and they say they want to hire you, then the next step is I'll send them a contract of employment. And I just started doing e-signing, so I use, I forget what the name of the e-signing app I use is, but if I can find it, I'll try to link it below. But there's a bunch of different things out there. You can figure it out to just like, you upload your contract and then there's like a little X and it says sign here, and then the person can sign there. They could type their name actually, and it's all electronic, so you don't have to worry about pen and ink signatures anymore. If you want a whole video on that, let me know in the comments. I can make that for you. I planned to make that a while ago and I haven't made it yet, but if there's interest, let me know. So after the initial contract and everything is ready to go, you guys are both on the same page, then it's time to start learning their business and start training. So the first thing you need to do is get a look at their bank accounts. Typically the owner will ask their bank to give you a separate login so that you can see what's in there. And then you want to kind of take stock of the situation, and then in your initial meeting, you probably would have discussed if they need QuickBooks Online, if they need a new subscription, or if they already have one. If they already have one, they should send you an invitation to join their QuickBooks Online. If you're setting one up from the beginning, it sounds kind of daunting, but it's actually pretty easy. It just walks you step by step through the process, like what's the business name, you know, which functions of QuickBooks do you need to use, and that type of thing. There's a lot of training videos out there. I can make one too. I try not to do too many QuickBooks tutorial videos just because that's kind of like not what I'm focusing on YouTube right now, but there's tons of options out there if you need to know how to set up a client in QuickBooks Online. So then you want to connect their bank account to the QuickBooks Online account if it's not already. And one problem I ran into is that some banks, depending on what kind of access you have, if you just have like view only access as the bookkeeper, you may not be able to connect to QuickBooks Online, so you may have to have your client do that if they aren't comfortable or if their bank isn't allowed to give you a certain kind of access. As well as at the end of the month, you're going to need the statements. Sometimes the statements aren't available in that read-only access as well. So just things to think about that might save you time, because that I spent some time trying to connect QuickBooks one time, and then it wouldn't work, and then I realized that was the problem. So usually I like to spend a little time just familiarizing myself with the client's business and what bank accounts they have, what credit cards they have, if they use PayPal or what they're using, and then kind of get started in the QuickBooks account. And then after I've kind of gotten a feel for it and maybe have some questions, I'll do another like half an hour to maybe an hour Zoom call with the client to go over all the questions. Sometimes the new things will come up and they'll be like, oh, actually I wanted to do this other thing, or, tweak this a little bit. So it's kind of nice to have that call before you get too far into the process, so that you can make sure you guys are, again, on the same page. As you can probably tell, communication is very key in this kind of relationship. And I did have a client recently who decided that they wanted to break things up into classes, which, is a way of dividing your income. So it was different real estate properties. So they wanted to see how profitable each property was. And I feel like they had that in their mind, but they didn't know the QuickBooks words to describe it. So they didn't know that it was called, you need to use classes. So it took a little bit of time for me to figure out, like, what are they looking for? And so in that case, it's helpful to try to figure those things out as early as possible, so you don't have to kind of go back and do extra work. It's better just to touch each transaction once if possible. And then in the second kind of conversation, it's good to talk about division of duties too, because there might be people working on site at their office that are doing certain jobs, and then maybe you're working remotely and doing other jobs, and talk about how you guys want to communicate. If there's any documents that need to be shared, how you're going to do that. Are you going to go pick up the paper once a week at the office? Are you going to have them email it to you? Are you going to use Google Docs to kind of throw stuff in a folder in there? So discuss all of those things. All right, so everything I've just talked about kind of happens in the first week, maybe 2 weeks. So it ramps up pretty quick. And then now I'm going to talk about kind of what the first month looks like. So oftentimes with a new client, there is some catch-up work to be done. So they're like, oh, I need all of last year completed, or I want you to start in January when it's the summertime or something. So that's not my favorite part of bookkeeping, but it is essential to start where the client wants to start, and then make sure all the books are consistent from that point onward. And usually the first month or first couple months, the workload is larger. So I always try to consider that when I'm thinking about taking on a new client. If it's, if I have a huge vacation planned, or if there's something really busy going on in my life, I'll either let them know, or I'll either tell them that I'm not going to be able to start till this date, or possibly not take on that client if it's not the right timing, because the beginning is usually more time intensive. All right, and then as I'm working, I do keep the client somewhat updated on my time that I'm taking, especially if it's a client that seems more budget conscious. So, I'll be like, okay, I've made it a fourth of the way through the year. That's taken me 5 hours. And, this is kind of a little bit of an estimate of what I expect for the remaining of the work, just so that they're not shocked when their invoice comes about how much time it's taken me and how much it's costing them. I have another video on pricing strategies, but in there I talk about how for the first few months I do an hourly rate, and then after that I try to fix it. Then after that I try to switch it to a fixed rate pricing. So at the beginning the client is going to get a bigger bill, most likely. All right, and as I'm working, after every day or chunk of work, I record my hours in the QuickBooks function. So there's a timekeeping function in QuickBooks, and you can be like, I worked 3 hours, these are the tasks I got done. Then at the end of the month, you can roll all of those times into an invoice. And just another little tip, I usually try to keep a document, like a Word document, open on my computer, and then I'll just jot down any questions that come up as I'm working, so that I can remember to talk about those all at once when I talk with the client. And one other thing that often helps me as well is sometimes I'll create an Excel document that's a spreadsheet with all their vendors. QuickBooks does learn to categorize things, so they'll learn like all the Providence medical things go into, employee health insurance or something. But sometimes I feel like there's holes in that process, and it's just easier for me to kind of keep my own list. So certain vendors that are kind of like problem vendors, or maybe things that are more tricky, like sometimes this is rent and sometimes this is wages, or a vendor that can be two different things, or anything kind of like tricky that I need to remember, then I'll put in a spreadsheet, and then I can just put notes and then look it up anytime I need to. And eventually, if I'm working for a client for years and years, usually I'll mostly be able to hold it in my brain. But as I'm learning, I don't want to keep asking the same question to the client over and over. And so I just make notes for myself. All right, so all that is about the beginning training process, and then you just get into your normal routine bookkeeping, which is my favorite part.